Okay, so Amelia and I had the first section of chapter 3. Yeah. So the background for different variations of sign languages, pages 67 and 68. So each country in the world has at least one sign language which is unique to that country, although many countries use more than one sign language. And there are approximately 144 different versions of sign language, which I thought was pretty cool. There's evidence found in historians' journals, archaeological records, camera and movie footage of George Veditz, who we got the picture there of, evolution of linguistics, and then brain imaging technology more recently are all ways to study sign languages and their similarities. Lexicostatistics is also a method that allows linguistics to examine language similarity percentages and relationships. So, for example, modern standard Thai sign language and ASL share 57% of signs, which is really neat. And then there are four major language communities which influenced North American Sign Languages development, and those communities are Indigenous, African American, European, and American. So the Indigenous community's version of sign language was called Hand Talk. That was covered on pages 68 and 69. And that's geographic separations between Indigenous tribes and communities, which influenced native sign language differences, otherwise known as Hand Talk. So deaf community members use various Hand Talk versions based on their location and the languages that their tribes were speaking. Archaeological records allow historians to study sign languages of 27 different tribes. I have them all listed there. And then North American Indian Sign Language is not just one language, but a family of sign language variations, which would cover all of the different variations like that went on in the different tribes that I've listed above. And then the genocide on indigenous traditions and languages, which came with like colonization in the boarding schools, also eradicated indigenous hand talk practice other than what we have in historical records and like oral history, which was passed down. And then links between early sign language and indigenous sign languages, where people would learn sign language to communicate with indigenous people. So there was an example in the book where General George Custer wanted to learn sign language from a deaf student so that he could better communicate with indigenous people. So I thought that was kind of neat. And then we've got Black American Sign Language, which is covered on pages 69 and 70. So these are historically noted that African language interpreters, like on the slave boats, used signs and gestures to communicate with British slave captors because there wasn't always a language interpreter around to benefit captured slaves and communicate slaves and their captors. So conversations were worked through with signs and gestures. And then segregation in schools also fostered like the divergence of American Sign Language. So it became like American Sign Language and Black American Sign Language. Because Black communities had to develop their own means of language socialization when they were separated. So traditional BASL tends to use more two-handed signs, more forehead level signs, and a larger signing space. And then use of less mouthing and a different vocabulary, such as incorporation of Black English into signs. And then I was curious as to what examples these might be, so I looked up a video of it, which I've got the source link there. But the examples, which I thought were kind of cool, were like ASL Christmas versus Black ASL Christmas, and ASL Curious versus BASL Curious. So I thought those were cool.
Okay. European communities, pages 71 to 72. So, it talks about many different countries that influenced sign language. So, for example, Spain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, there's also Holland. So, in 1620, Juan Martin Pablo wrote a book describing different ways to teach deaf children. Because in Spain, if one wanted to own property, they had to be literate. At the time, there was no schools for the deaf, so they had to create schools so deaf children could then own property. In 1760, Abbé d'Ayapi, a French priest, opened a school for the deaf in Paris. Abbé d'Ayapi took French signing and then conformed it to French grammar and created what was called the French method. Not everyone agreed with the French method. Roche Ambrose thought that add-ons were cumbersome and preferred the natural sign. Many of Ayapi's students that agreed with the French method then became teachers, including Laurent Clerc. Euro-American communities, pages 72 to 73. One of the first students in America was Alice Cogswell, who at the time was taught by Lydia Huntley in the early 19th century in Hartford, Connecticut. She was using the old alphabet, or the two-handed alphabet. Later, Mason Cogswell hired a minister to teach his daughter. His name was Thomas Gallaudet. Gallaudet wanted to learn more ways to be a better teacher, which included going to a conference from the Deaf School of Paris, where there were two teachers there who were Laurent Clerc and Jean Massue. Gallaudet and Clerc returned to America, where they established the first school for the deaf, now called the American School for Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, also known as Gallaudet University. Other people at that time were creating schools across the world. Joseph Henron from Belgium, Edward Huet from Mexico and Brazil, Brother Young from Quebec. Alright, next we have home signs and gestures, pages 73. Different communities that impacted ASL were the Native American communities, African American communities, European, Euro-Americans. Another type of sign that was used was home sign. That was the gestures deaf children would use at home to communicate with parents. One, for example, was milk. Students would sign milk, which is similar to what it looks like when people are squeezing milk out of an udder. Gestures rely on body language and the labeling of objects through miming or acting out. Home signs do not have a consistent meaning-symbol relationship or formal grammar. Once those children enter the deaf world, the home signs evolved and grammar emerges. This takes 2 to 3 generations for standardization to occur. Village signs, page 73 to 74. Deaf hearing signing communities. That was where both deaf people and hearing people communicated with sign. 2 examples are Henniker, New Hampshire, and Sandy River Valley, Maine. One of the most famous villages was Martha's Vineyard. In 1694, the first deaf person arrived on the island, and after, for more than 70 years, many genetically deaf children were born. That was done through many intermarriages within the family. To facilitate communication on the island, both hearing and deaf people communicated with sign language, specifically Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, which is now used very little and even not really at all. There are researchers who are currently studying Martha's Vineyard. They are taking the different pictures and videos and putting it together to try to figure out what it would look like. When children moved from Martha's Vineyard, they would move to Hartford to go to Gallaudet or other deaf colleges in the United States, and there the signing language is mixed. This is called language contact. The mix of many different sign languages is how we formed the current sign language.